Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate those kind words. I learned a lot about myself. Listen, there's a lot of material here. Probably too much material for the time allotted. But this talk and the one I'll give tomorrow has been, you can download it from my website, E.Flege.com. So if you want to see this material a little bit more slowly, you can just download it and have a look. Okay, so let's see. In his famous outline of English phonetics, Daniel Jones, who can be maybe credited as being the founder of modern phonetics, observed that whereas languages like Danish tend to produce English potoko when they learn English as an L2 with too much aspiration, speakers of Romance languages like French or Italian produce these same English stops with too little aspiration. Today we would refer to these differences in terms of voice onset time. This talk will provide introductory information regarding the voice onset time dimension. In my keynote tomorrow, I'll present research examining the production and perception of potoko and bodaga in a second language. My hope is that this overview will get you ready for tomorrow's talk and help provide a more general understanding of the processes involved. As a preview of things to come, the research I'll be presenting has convinced me that L2 input is a far more important determinant of eventual success in L2 speech learning. Is a far more important determinant of success than is the age at which the learning of a second language begins. Undergraduate students, perhaps your own, often learn about the VOT dimension, which has been quite popular in L2 research. So getting back to VOT, it's very popular, and that's due, at least in part, to the fact that it's easy to measure. The problem is, however, that it's also very easy to make mistakes when examining VOT. Consider this as an example. We compare two groups of university students in the Netherlands in an 87 paper. You see here foreign accent ratings ordered in ascending order. As expected, most of those who studied English, most of the Dutch people who studied English at Utrecht had a better overall pronunciation of English than those who studied engineering at Delft. When here are the VOT values, again, are arranged in ascending order. The problem is that some of the English majors in Utrecht seem to have figured out the aim of our research and began to exaggerate VOT. Unfortunately, there's no way to distinguish those who exaggerated from those who were speaking normally, and so this is an essentially worthless data set. Worthless, but the problem could have been solved very, very easily. So it's a big mistake, and I'm not, this type of mistake is made often, let's put it that way. The research I'll consider today focuses on voiced and voiceless stop consonants occurring in the word initial pre-stressed position in mostly English words. For example, the p and k and p in the sentence Paul ate carrots and peas. VOT varies, as you all know, according to the timing of laryngeal and supralaryngeal gestures. It's defined as an interval of time, that is, the interval between the release of stop closure and the onset of glottal pulsing in the larynx. For bodaga, the vocal folds must be brought together, adducted, at midline for glottal pulsing to occur. For the voiceless stops, a very precise, at least this is true for English, a very precise abduction gesture is needed to rapidly open and then reclose the vocal folds at midline. Daniel Jones referred to the perceptual effect of VOT differences as differences in aspiration. It was Arthur Abramson and Lee Lisker working at Haskins Labs in Connecticut who brought the VOT dimension to the attention of a wide range of researchers in phonetics and allied disciplines in the 60s. Use of the VOT dimension has helped systemize our understanding of phonetic differences between languages. It's inspired hundreds, literally hundreds of studies reviewed recently by Arthur and Doug Whalen, and it's provided a serviceable bridge between speech production and speech perception. Early work by Arthur and Lee called attention to the existence of 3 modal VOT ranges in human languages, which you all know. However, later work soon revealed the presence of non-modal VOT values. For example, Japanese has stops whose VOT values fall in between the modal short lag and long lag VOT values of Romance language BDG and in English PTK. Languages like Danish have VOT values that exceed the modal long lag VOT values of English, and there are many other examples. Children learning their native language establish language-specific phonetic categories based on what they hear. For example, children learning English in a monolingual environment will encounter a distribution of VOT values like this for T in slow, careful speech. What they hear will define their later production and perception. Children learning languages having shorter or longer VOT values than English will develop different language-specific phonetic categories. This is all pretty obvious. VOT and word initial stops may co-occur, co-vary, or coexist with other acoustic properties having perceptual cue value. The list is pretty long and I have no time to go into it. Now let's consider how VOT is used in English and Romance languages such as French or Italian. English is classified as an aspiration language. Romance languages, on the other hand, as voicing languages. The distinction is based essentially on cue reliability. Aspiration is reliably present in the long lag productions of English PTK, but is minimal and sometimes absent in short lag productions of PTK in the Romance languages. Glottal pulsing is reliably present in the lead VOT productions of Romance language BDG, but is often absent in English BDG. The difference between PTK in English and Romance language is straightforward, but not the differences for BDG. For example, in a 2001 study, we examined production of B by 20 Italian monolinguals. 99.5% of tokens were produced with pre-voicing. The English monolinguals pre-voiced B just 24% of the time, and their pre-voicing, when it actually did occur, died out before stop release in 72% of instances, something never observed in Italian monolinguals' production of Italian B. In an 82 study, we calculated the percentage of B and P closure intervals that were filled with glottal pulsing. In the utterance initial position in the initial position of utterance medial and final words, a large difference existed between B and P, even in post-stressed position. However, in absolute utterance initial position, the difference in glottal pulsing between English B and P was minimal. Dmitriev, in a recent article, like others before, observed enormous differences in the use of pre-voicing by 30 English monolinguals. One participant always pre-voiced, 7 never pre-voiced, and 22 others pre-voiced some of the time. The language-specific phonetic realization rules used to produce phonetic differences between BDG and PTK are straightforward in Romance languages. Phonetic organization is less clear in English. A consideration of laryngeal timing patterns in English may, however, help clarify the situation. In a 1982 article, I examined 3 dimensions in the production of English B. the closure and release of labial constriction was defined on the basis of variation in intraoral air pressure. Glottal pulsing was sensed using a very sensitive throat mic. And the timing of vocal fold adduction was monitored using a Forsan laryngograph. Here's an example of a pre-voice token of English B in which the vocal folds were adducted long before stop release. Only later, but well before stop release, did voicing, that is glottal pulsing, begin. This study revealed less variability in laryngeal timing patterns than in acoustically measured VOT. 2 out of the 9 monolinguals that we examined adducted the vocal folds at the moment of stop release, always producing short lag VOT values and B. 7 others adducted the vocal folds roughly 200 milliseconds before stop release. For these 7 English monolinguals, there was always a delay between vocal fold adduction and voicing onset, and sometimes the voicing ceased before stop release. The one Spanish-English bilingual we tested showed a different pattern of laryngeal timing, using a soft phonation onset when producing B. For him, glottal pulsing began as soon as the vocal folds were adducted at midline, about 100 milliseconds before stop release. Once voicing began, it continued without interruption until stop release. Additional research is definitely needed to determine if a soft phonation onset is typical for native speakers of Romance languages. We just don't know, or at least I don't know. If so, it could explain why all of the Italian monolinguals examined in our 2001 study pre-voiced, and why their pre-voicing continued without interruption until stop release. I propose that children learning English as their native language develop either a lead or a short lag phonetic category for English Bodega. The kind of category in this view that children learning English in a monolingual environment will eventually develop, according to this proposal, will depend on the input that they receive. A minority of children who learn English will hear mostly short lag realizations of B. They will learn to adduct the vocal folds at the moment of stop release and, later in life, will always produce short lag VOT. The majority of children, however, will hear B produced with full or partial pre-voicing more often than they've heard short lag VOT. Pre-voicing is the dominant pattern for them. They will learn to adduct the vocal folds about 200 milliseconds before stop release. As adults, the children who establish lead phonetic categories for Bodega will pre-voice Bodega some of the time. The phonetic realization rules they develop to produce their lead phonetic categories for Bodega will not guarantee an immediate onset of glottal pulsing, nor a continuation of voicing until stop release, as seems to be the case for the Romance languages. A phonetic realization rule like the ones presumably found in languages like French and Italian is not necessary in English, an aspiration language. This is because the primary phonetic goal of English is to guarantee the presence of aspiration in Bodega, not the presence of glottal pulsing before the release of Bodega. Now, I've mentioned phonetic categories several times, and you might be asking, well, what does E.Flege think they are? A phonetic category, in my way of thinking, is a perceptual representation that speaker hearers develop over time in long-term memory that's based on the phonetic input they receive. It's defined by all of the tokens encountered on the phonetic surface that have been identified as being instances of a phonetic category. According to a 95 paper, we specified phonetic categories for word initial stops in the following manner. That we stated that the representations specify how the stop consonants ought to sound when produced, as well as the relative importance, that is the weighting of various acoustic phonetic dimensions as perceptual cues to the distinction between that category and others. Phonetic categories are, of course, inherently multidimensional. The absolute normative values of the dimensions, as well as their relative importance, may vary as a function of phonetic context, degree of stress or emphasis in speaking rate, and so on. Among monolingual speakers of a single language, individual differences may exist in the relative weighting of acoustic phonetic dimensions. However, such individual differences are normally smaller than those distinguishing speakers of different languages. As for defining how phonetic elements ought to sound via self-hearing, consider these results from our 95 study. The 17 members of a VOT continuum ranging from ba to pa were randomly presented to English monolinguals who used a 9-point scale to rate the VOT stimuli for goodness as an instance of the English P category. The monolinguals gave increasingly high ratings as VOT values in the stimuli increased. As VOT increased further, going beyond values typical for English, the listeners gave increasingly lower ratings. Information stored in their phonetic categories guided the listeners' responses and defined for them how English P ought to sound. Several days later, the English monolinguals came back and identified the same VOT stimuli using one of 3 labels: phonologically voiced, B, phonologically voiceless, P, let's call it, or as an exaggerated P. Their BP phoneme boundary was only slightly more decisive than the crossover between P and exaggerated P, a non-category that was not defined or illustrated for the participants. Here we see both the goodness ratings and the identification data. The peak in the goodness ratings and the greatest frequency of P identifications coincided at the stimulus having a VOT value of 50 milliseconds. As already mentioned, phonetic categories are motorically output using phonetic realization rules. These rules continue to develop until they yield phonetic segments that coincide with inner representations of how the phonetic segments ought to sound. Now let's consider the identification of pötökö by speakers of English and Romance languages. Williams, in a really lovely Harvard dissertation, tested both Spanish and English monolinguals on a synthetic B to P continuum. For both languages, the percentage of P judgments increased systematically as VOT increased. You've seen these many times before. The phoneme boundary occurred at longer VOT values for English than Spanish monolinguals. In '86, we replicated these findings using a da to ta continuum whose members were identified by Spanish and English monolinguals, both children and adults. The findings obtained for Spanish and English suggest that VOT functions similarly in English and Romance languages, and that the most important difference between English and Romance languages are the absolute values of VOT needed to shift identification from predominantly voiced to voiceless stop identifications. But this is not always the case, as we can see in data obtained from monolingual speakers of Canadian French by Karamazov. He expected to obtain identification functions for French just like those obtained earlier for Spanish and English monolinguals. What he got instead was quite different, was really messy. The lack of monotonicity in the identification functions suggested to Karamazov that the VOT dimension was insufficient to permit French Canadians to perceptually distinguish voiced and voiceless stops. His findings may have reflected a difference in the relative perceptual weight of voicing and aspiration in Canadian and European French. Another possibility, a sound change in progress. Karamazov found that French speakers in French in France rarely produced BDG with short lag VOT, while those in Canada did so over half the time, presumably the result of exposure to short lag renditions of BDG in English and in English accented French. Perhaps to compensate for a change in how French BDG were being produced by people around them, the French speakers in Quebec produced BDG with significantly longer VOT values than did monolinguals in France. Doing so would help the French Canadians maintain a phonetic contrast between BDG and PTK in their native language. Now, the kind of cross-language differences just mentioned arise as the result of the learning of language-specific properties of the native language. Children acquiring their native language gradually I emphasize, become mature speaker-hearers of their L1 because they have the capacity to make optimal use of input. Some believe that not all learners of an L2 have the same capacities possessed by children learning their native language. The critical period hypothesis assumes, at least implicitly, that some of the core capacities used by L1 speech learning, used during L1 acquisition, are lost or attenuated later in life. The research presented in this next section leads me to question that underlying assumption. The speech learning capacities I have in mind are the abilities to, number one, auditorially detect phonetic differences between contrastive sets of speech sounds found in the L1 and L2. Second, to use statistical information derived from input received to construct auditory equivalence classes. Third, to develop long-term memory representations, phonetic categories, deriving from the equivalence classes. And finally, to create the capacity to create motor plans that can be used to reproduce the information specified in the phonetic categories. Children learning in L1 must sort ambient language phones into sound types. They're forced to depend on messy input. They have no choice because they can't know beforehand how many categories their L1 will have. Cognitive mechanisms permit sounds encountered on the phonetic surface to be aggregated into inchoate equivalence classes based on multiple dimensions. As more input is received, the equivalence classes evolve into phonetic categories that can be used to identify words. The phonetic categories continue to develop slowly over time via the cognitive mechanisms of acquired distinctiveness and acquired similarity. As phonetic categories mature, category centers emerge. The category centers, which are derived from frequency patterns in the input received, permit speaker-hearers to identify an array of L1 phones as instances of a single category with increasing speed and accuracy, and to recognize speech sounds in non-ideal listening conditions. The category centers also permit listeners to notice and report differences in the goodness of an array of VOT stimuli as instances of a particular category, as was mentioned earlier. Now, if the capacities needed to learn the L1 are later in life lost or diminished, that is, following the end of a critical period, we need to ask ourselves what specific capacities are affected. Perhaps phonetic information not relevant to phonemic contrast in the native language will be discarded and so unavailable for use in L2 learning. As an example, native English learners of French might ignore pre-voicing in French if they consider the presence versus absence of pre-voicing to be a bothersome allophonic detail, especially if they themselves typically produce English BDG with both lead and short lag VOT. Another possibility is that cross-language phonetic differences get filtered out in early stages of auditory processing if not already used to specify L1 phonetic categories. In '84, I evaluated this filtering hypothesis by examining the ability of monolingual English adults to detect small VOT differences. The stimuli were English T and TU tokens, half produced by English monolinguals, the other half by native speakers of French who spoke English with mild foreign accents. VOT in these two sets of stimuli differed by an average of 24 milliseconds, much less than the VOT difference between English and French. To ensure that vowel quality would not affect judgments, the variable burst plus VOT intervals of the natural syllables were cross-spliced onto a single native-produced vowel. 10 native English listeners heard 2 English stimuli per trial, one produced by a native English speaker, the other by a native speaker of French. Their task was to decide which member of each pair had been produced by the non-native speaker. Now, they were quite able to select the foreign members of the stimuli. They were, in effect, able to detect cross-language VOT differences having an average value of 24 milliseconds. If, in the future, these listeners would want to learn French as a second language, French versus English VOT differences should be no problem. We can therefore reject the filtering hypothesis. Now, in the study I just briefly mentioned, the 2 stimuli were presented on each trial. The findings, therefore, don't demonstrate the ability to construct auditory equivalence classes for the stimuli differing in VOT. The next study, however, overcame that limitation. In 1982, Bob Hammond and I tested native English students taking a first-year Spanish class at the University of Florida. The class was taught by several native speakers of Spanish who spoke English with rather strong Spanish accents. 50 participants were selected from the original sample of 125. All of them had lived in Florida for at least the previous 5 years and were personally acquainted with native speakers of Spanish. The participants were recorded in a language lab following their midterm oral examination in Spanish. They were asked to read a list of English sentences with a typical Spanish accent. We didn't provide any explanation about what we meant by speaking with a Spanish accent. The participants found the task wildly entertaining, probably because their teachers were there. They had a chance to mimic their teachers. Each of the sentences contained 2 test words. For example, the vase is on the pig. The 2 variable test words in each sentence began with the sound sometimes produced incorrectly in Spanish accented English. For example, pig is sometimes produced with E, pig, in Spanish accented English rather than as pig. Phonetic transcriptions of the test words yield 500 of these Spanish accent substitutions, and we counted them. We never did hear a D for T substitution, but VOT measurements showed that indeed the initial T tokens in the test words were modified. The 2 subgroups of 10 each were selected for acoustic analysis. We'll call those who produced the fewest number of Spanish accent substitutions the least knowledge group, and those who produced the largest number the most knowledge group. It's likely that members of the most knowledge group had received more exposure to Spanish accented English than those in the least knowledge group. We also recorded productions of the same sentences by a control group of native English speakers who simply read the utterances with no special instructions. For T tokens in both utterance initial and final words, the most knowledge group, but not the least knowledge group, produced significantly shorter VOT values than the control group. In this frequency histogram, we see that members of the control group never produced T with Spanish-like VOT values. However, members of the most knowledge group did so frequently. Members of the least knowledge group also did so, but with less frequency. In summary, the adult English monolinguals shortened VOT in word initial T tokens by an average of 30 milliseconds. They were able to detect VOT differences between their native language and an accented version of their native language. They were able to store the detected information in long-term memory, and they were able to, at a later time, use that information in production. From these results, I conclude that young adults who have passed the end of the so-called critical period maintain the core capacities needed for L2 speech learning. But what about the ability to aggregate sets of diverse speech sounds into equivalence classes and later into phonetic categories? Two studies bear on this issue. Pizzoni in an '82 study asked English monolinguals to use two labels to identify the members of a VOT continuum. The results were quite unsurprising. On a separate day of testing, the students were also asked to use three category labels. Nearly all of them spontaneously divided the category into lead, short lag, and long lag VOT categories, even though a lead versus short lag distinction is not phonemic in English. In 1990, Jim Hillenbrand recruited three groups of participants at Northwestern University. The phonetically trained group were speech researchers and speech-language pathologists. The musically trained group were all highly skilled musicians from the Northwestern University Music School. And finally, there was an untrained group of undergraduates who had just begun an introductory course in phonetics. The participants were asked to identify randomly presented members of a VOT continuum as B or P. The results for the three groups were, of course, quite similar and unsurprising. However, between-group differences emerged when the participants were later asked to use three labels to identify the same stimuli. The labels were a clear B, clear P, and then something in the middle, something indefinite that was a little bit like B and a little bit like P. As in the Pizzoni study, no training or explanation was provided on how to use three labels. Here we see just the percentage of indefinite, the intraphonemic judgments. The clear B and clear P judgments are not shown here. The phoneticians were better able to use the non-phonemic indefinite category significantly better than the other two groups. Now, we don't know if the phonetician's ability to aggregate a set of stimuli on the fly was due to an innate ability, or if the work they were doing augmented this capacity. Whatever the source, I suspect that differences like this one are relevant to L2 speech learning. In a 1980 study, we observed a really huge amount of variability among native Spanish lay learners in the production of English VOT. Once again, I've arranged the stimuli increasing order. And so you see some people are some of the Spanish learners of English are perfectly English-like, others are perfectly Spanish-like, and then we have everything in between. Variability like this has generated intense interest in individual differences in L2 speech learning. Cognitive tests that identify individual differences in measures of paired associate learning, selective memory, attentional switching, and so on, usually prove to be only weak predictors of the outcomes of laboratory training that involve young adults with normal hearing. However, the kind of inter-subject variability I just illustrated was the result of input obtained over years, not hours. Learning speech naturalistically through immersion is a very different process from pushing buttons in a lab, and so the results of laboratory training studies may not generalize to long-term L2 speech learning. In my view, the best way to identify the source of individual differences in long-term speech learning is to focus on core capacities. One of these is the ability to aggregate sets of sounds and hold them in memory, as we saw earlier in the Pizzoni and Hillenbrand experiments. This aggregation ability, in turn, depends on phonological short-term memory. In a 2001 study, we evaluated phonological short-term memory using a non-word repetition task. The stimuli were sets of non-words created by splicing 2 to 5 Italian CD syllables together, then digitally modifying the strings to ensure the perception of constant penultimate stress. The 5 sets of non-words were presented in blocks of increasing length for repetition, and the number of correct responses counted. The non-word repetition test was administered to 72 native speakers of Italian, all long-term residents of Canada. The number of non-words repeated correctly was completely unrelated to language background and L2 experience, because phonological short-term memory is an individual characteristic. The phonological short-term memory scores did, however, partially predict the Italian subject's identification of word initial and word final English consonants. These consonant identification scores, in turn, partially predicted the recognition of English words. We can't hope to understand L2 speech learning if we don't first understand how speech develops in the native language. It takes many years for children to become mature speaker-hearers of their native language. Long after children have established the ability to distinguish the phonemes of their language, language-specific phonetic categories continue to develop. L1 phonetic development takes many years to complete because phonetic categories encode a complex array of information derived from exposure to huge numbers of tokens. These long-term memory representations integrate information from multiple dimensions across contexts. In addition to defining category centers, phonetic categories must encompass outliers, although unusual, these must still be processed as members of the category. This explains why, for example, adults are better able than children to recognize words produced with a foreign accent. If an 8-year-old child learning English in a monolingual environment differs from his or her parents, either in production or perception, we do not say that the child has failed to learn. We say the child is still learning. As I noted in the 1987 article, enthusiasm for the critical period hypothesis has tended to impede progress in L2 speech research by making more readily testable hypotheses, such as those regarding the influence of the quality and the quantity of input, appear to be unwarranted. In my opinion, L2 learners should not be expected to develop phonetic categories and language-specific realization rules for L2 speech sounds more rapidly than so-called pre-critical period children who are acquiring their native language. I therefore propose the following benchmark for individuals of all ages who are learning the VOT dimension in a second language, and that is 10 years of native speaker input. Given time limits, I can't review all of the data upon which this benchmark is proposed, but very briefly, to begin, children's production of VOT, in English at least, is more variable than adults until about 13 years of age. Second, children are less able than adults to correctly identify speech sounds in non-ideal listening conditions. Children continue to develop to differ from adults when recognizing consonants presented in reverberation until about the age of 13. And they continue to differ from adults in recognizing consonants in noise until the ages of about 13 to 15. Johnson examined the identification of English consonants in quiet and in noise. Adults outperformed children aged 6 to 7 and 10 to 11 in both conditions. When just the voicing feature was considered, even 14 to 15-year-old children differed from adults. Elliott found that monolingual English children needed longer intervals than adults in order to discriminate stops differing in VOT. Finally, in the 1986 study, we found differences in the identification of stops between 8 to 9-year-old children and adults. In both languages, Spanish and English, adults required significantly longer VOT values to shift from predominantly "de" to "te" judgments. In a follow-up study, we found that the phoneme boundaries of even children adolescents aged 17 years of age differed significantly from those of English adults. And in an 86 paper, we found that Spanish and English adults produced T with longer VOT values than children. This just barely missed reaching significance. I'm going to, just before concluding, I want to mention something very important to L2 speech learning, that is interlingual identification. This cognitive mechanism serves as a perceptual bridge between the L1 and L2 sound systems. Interlingual identification operates automatically when listeners encounter forms of speech that differ from their own. L2 learners seek and inevitably find correspondence, that is not to say perfect matches, between sounds in their L1 and L2. For example, Spanish monolinguals consistently identify long-lagged English stops as P, despite large cross-language differences in VOT. The aim of a 93 study was to assess the interlingual identification of word initial English stops by native speakers of Spanish. In addition to a group of English monolinguals, we recruited 3 groups of Spanish speakers in Birmingham, monolinguals who had just arrived, early native Spanish learners of English, and late learners of English. The stimuli we used to assess interlingual identification consisted of 4 sets of naturally produced CV stimuli drawn from Spanish and English. The task of the 4 groups of participants was to identify the syllable initial consonant as D or T. As we see here, the Spanish and English monolinguals consistently identified stimuli with lead and long-lag VOT as D and T respectively. However, the 2 groups of monolinguals were equally confused in how they identified stimuli that had been produced with short-lag VOT. So first, let's consider the English D stimuli that were produced with short-lag VOT. If only VOT mattered, the Spanish monolinguals would be expected to identify these stimuli consistently as T. In fact, they did so less than half the time. VOT did not, by itself, convince the Spanish monolinguals that the short-lag English T stimuli were instances of their short-lag Spanish T category. Now let's consider the Spanish T stimuli having short-lag VOT. If only VOT mattered, these stimuli should be consistently identified as T by Spanish monolinguals and D by English monolinguals. In neither of 2 stimulus range conditions were these expectations met for either the Spanish or the English monolinguals. Once again, neither group was completely convinced by VOT. The same held true for early and late L2 learners. No one was convinced by VOT, even the bilinguals who were perfectly aware of Spanish versus English VOT differences. Why not? We examined the identification of the Spanish stops I just mentioned in 2 different experiments. Here we see the data for all 40 participants pooled. Participants responded in much the same way in both of the 2 experiments. Surprisingly, the token effects were much larger than the between-group differences. We tried to find some acoustic measure that could differentiate the usually T from the ambiguous stimuli. We measured VOT, fundamental frequency contours, burst intensity and duration of the following vowel, and so on. Nothing worked. A large focus study would probably succeed in identifying acoustic phonetic dimensions that, when taken together, would predict identification of short-lag Spanish and English stops, ST or D. In the meantime, those who do L2 research should remember that VOT is not a unidimensional property of stop consonants, and that the outcome of early stages of L2 learning will be influenced by the initial mapping of L2 sounds onto L1 categories via interlingual identification. The initial mapping between L1 and L2 sounds may in turn depend on cue weighting in individual learners' native language phonetic categories at the time L2 learning begins. A common error in L2 research is the assumption that all speakers of a particular L1 have a single starting point with respect to the L2 when learning begins. When, if differences exist, they may contribute to differing outcomes in L2 speech learning that masquerade as differences in speech learning aptitude. So that's it for part one, and then I'll pick up tomorrow and tell you where these factors take us in actual L2 learning. That's it. Thank you.